I know our next lunch is here, so it's hard. It's going to be really hard for Jonathan Brack to do this next part. We're going to bang it out in about half an hour or so, and then I'd like to say thanks to Sunsplash Jamaican for bringing us our delicious lunch, so we got that to look forward to.
Hi.
My name's J.C. McCauley.
I'm Naisha McCauley, and you're watching AccessTV.org.
Thanks. We want to harness your ideas and your energy. So I want to introduce Jonathan Brack. He's here from Forward Change, and he's going to be facilitating this part of the workshop. He's going to explain to us what's next. Thanks for coming, John.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and privilege. It really, it was humbling to hear this conversation in the room. I'm from Oakland, California. I came out last night. I'm with Forward Change. We are a consultancy firm that works with nonprofits, cities, foundations on figuring out, bringing the best to bear in research, but also figuring out what are the best solutions to create positive life outcomes for our young people, and particularly boys and men of color. So who I am not is Arnold Chandler, who is our keynote, and I'm doing my best impersonation for the next few minutes. He's going to give you a presentation that this is a part of later on this afternoon, and be much more eloquent than I am in this moment. But we're gonna be adaptive here and flip what the plan was and do this exercise first. And while it's a little bit out of order, I think given the conversation earlier and the need and want and the sense of urgency around what can we do, this exercise we're gonna take part in is gonna help us out and really start to get there and put pen to paper. So, what you're looking at is a lot of work that Arnold has put in on figuring out and leveraging the social science research that's out there to map what are both the best on-track outcomes that we know that produce a thriving life for an individual, and then what are the off-track outcomes or points along the life cycle that put people in a place where they're not thriving, right? And so, just to orient you to the slide, everything I hear along the top are those on-track outcomes. So, school readiness, math and reading proficiency, high school graduation, and so forth. These are all, again, research-based and laid across the life course itself. So you see the age ranges are 0 to 5, 6 to 11, all the way up to 26 to 35. So then what you have on the bottom here are all the research-based off-track outcomes that end up putting people down at that end of earning far below the federal poverty level. Around the top where this circle is are what Arnold likes to call the ecological contextual factors that are put into and are taken consideration of how these outcomes happen. So it's your class status, it's single parenthood, high school dropout, if your father was incarcerated. These extra factors impact, from an intergenerational standpoint, how young people and all of us end up thriving or not. So what we'll point out, and again, Arnold will go into the presentation and be able to give you much more context around this. But essentially, we're going to focus on this bottom track here, and as a group, start to think about what are the places where we can what are the places that we want to interrupt this cycle that's pushing our young people into the prison system. So the first point on the off-track line is not school ready, right? Not being there with social emotional skills and cognitive development skills through parents and their families. That's one of the main predictors leading to juvenile arrest and detention, chronic absenteeism, fails math or English in the 8th or 9th grade, all of these things are interconnected in how they lead to young people ending up in the system, particularly leading to high school dropout. That is one of the, if not the most main predictor of someone ending up in the system. And so what we're seeing is each of these factors are interdependent, and often you can imagine one person going through this life cycle, and any one or more of these things can happen. All these wonderful arrows are here to show you that connectedness, but also to try to get us to a point where we can think about where do we interrupt along this line, and particularly leading to the high school dropout. One of the things, though, to point out is that ending up in the system doesn't always clearly come through high school dropout. That juvenile arrest or detention as a young person, you could have a high school degree and still end up there. So what we're asking you to do is we're going to have you break out into groups based on domains and issue areas that will, and then we're going to ask you to go through an exercise to think about what are the things right now in your sphere of influence, in your current role, and collectively we can do to interrupt. Okay? So the different domain groups are, and this is where, I know I'm between lunch, you guys and lunch, but this is where we're going to have to ask you to, collect your stuff and actually get up and move around. Nancy here has some wonderful labels for each of the groups. I'm going to read them out loud. And again, what you're trying to do is self-select into the group that you most identify with, and then we'll go through an exercise. So the groups are school chronic absence, dropout prevention, and student recovery. They are school discipline, school academics and curriculum, again focusing on in 6 through 12, grades 6 through 12, juvenile justice, mental health, violence prevention, youth employment, youth homelessness, post-secondary education, disconnected youth, and then adult prison reentry and employment. So I know you guys memorized all 11 of those groups. You know exactly where you're going to go. Before we do that, I'm going to walk through the exercise quickly, and then we'll refresh when we sit down in our groups. But essentially, we're going to start with brainstorming 5 priority areas that you want to focus on. So if you self-select into the school discipline group, where along these off-track outcomes do you see the place to disrupt and interrupt the cycle the most, particularly in your role here in Hartford? And then the second thing, you're going to identify what are constituencies of support in these priority areas. So what are the policy decisions that need to happen? And then what is the primary outcome you're looking for? It's also an opportunity to start to think about what needs to stop happening. Like what's actually going on in our systems and our organizations that need to not happen anymore. Then we'll identify a policy or program intervention within those priority areas. And then we're going to ask you to do what's called a pre-mortem. So as you come up with these priority areas, if they were not to work out, what would be their downfall? What would cause them to fall and die? And then finally, the goal there is to come up with each group to have 1 to 2 priority areas, which we'll use in the afternoon presentation from Arnold. So again, we'll repeat the groups and point in the general direction of where they're at. So you just need to ask yourself, what group do I want to be a part of? And then the instructions will be on a sheet on your paper. So again, the first group is school chronic absence, dropout prevention, and student recovery. The second group is school discipline. The third group is school academics and curriculum. The fourth group is juvenile justice. The 5th group is mental health. The 6th group is violence prevention. 7th is youth employment. 8th is youth homelessness. 9 is post-secondary education. And 10, disconnected youth. And then finally, 11 is adult prison, reentry, and employment. Where's that table at? Back there. All right. So if you could gather your things, go to your table, and we'll come back together in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, so you have now solved the school to prison pipeline in each of your domains. Congratulations. Go home. Have a great weekend. No. If you can try to finish up one of your last thoughts here, we're gonna look to break to lunch here in just a moment. We will be coming back to this in the afternoon. Okay. So if I could get everyone's attention for just a moment before we break. Really exciting to hear all of the great conversation going. So at the very least, on your papers, on your, there's a lot of great stuff. Make sure you can clearly identify on your paper, one, what your domain name is, what your group is on your paper, on the butcher paper. So this group here will put school discipline on their actual paper. And then your 2 priority areas, if you have a lot of text on your paper, try to circle your 2 priority areas or star it or some way that we can identify it easily. We're going to ask that you place your paper up on this wall over here to my left. So just to repeat, you need to put your group name and clearly identify your 2 priority areas. Don't worry if this wasn't complete. We're going to come back to this in the afternoon. And post Arnold's presentation will be much more clear. All right, so last time, ensure that your group's name is on your paper. The 2 priority areas that your group determined to focus on is identified, and you put it up on that wall over there.
I know usually this is nap time for some folks, like when we have our little ones in our early learning centers. This is nap time, but we do not want it to be nap time for you guys. Because indeed, our featured speaker today, Mr. Arnold Chandler, he made it here successfully, so we're excited about that. It's like, you never know nowadays, right? So we really appreciate you coming. I mentioned it a little earlier. When we started putting these series together, these events together, I was fortunate that I had these people I thought would be these amazing speakers. And I did think it was important to really talk about what's going on in Hartford, because Hartford is Hartford. Hartford is unique. We have our little quirks here and there. And I really wanted us to be able to have someone, though, with this national expertise to really speak to us about what's going on and what the data is showing us. And so Mr. Chandler was with us last year and really talked about the life course framework and these key milestones, and kind of blew our minds. And the cool thing was that he, along with his partner, T. Martinez, was really able to bring in the beginnings of some key characteristics about Hartford. So it took us a while to do this next piece, but I'm so excited for him to be back here in the city again so we can do a deep dive. And the goal of today, and you're hopefully already feeling it, is for us to move this work to action. So it's not just about awareness, it's not just about talking, this is not about a nice social event, this is actually continuing to launch the work. So that's what's going to happen today. And so I'm so proud to have him and Forward Change here. So a little bit about Forward Change, the mission-driven consulting firm. They help folks like us but also foundations, community-based organizations, government and other agencies improve the lives of children, young adults, and families, especially those living in disadvantaged communities. And they do it by really developing and helping us to develop and implement effective strategies informed by rigorous research and analysis that both empower and align essential stakeholders to drive change forward. So Mr. Arnold L. Chandler, he's an advocate, researcher, trainer, and a strategy consultant. That's a mouthful right there. But he's been working for more than 15 years, helping nonprofits and foundations and other places like us really advance programs and policies focused on social and economic equity. I gotta tell you, we talk a lot about equity, and I just love the idea of social and economic equity. Many of you guys know my background is actually in economics, and I think that's a power that we need to realize here for ourselves and our families in Hartford. But Arnold's been working on these efforts to improve the health and well-beings, especially boys and men of color, since 2007. And when I first heard him speak, actually was in New Orleans for convening for Aspen Institute around Opportunity Youth and talking about boys and young men of color. So I'm just so pleased that he's able to be, again, here with us today. Recently, he was a senior policy associate with the Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy at UC Berkeley Law School, working on policies to improve the lives of boys and men of color across California. Before that, he was a research analyst working with a team to reform the Oakland Police Department to reduce bias policing and police abuse as part of a federal lawsuit settled back in 2001. And now, again, he works with us to advance our most mission-critical strategic initiatives, and his work focuses on impacting strategy, evidence-based practices, leadership development for social change, and equity-focused organizations. Now, I can go on and on, but I think, again, that's already a lot and enough for us to know he is obviously well qualified to be here and speak to us this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Arnold Chandler from Forward Change Consulting.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for bearing with me. I guess someone mentioned earlier that I've been getting, I was going to say stiffed repeatedly by Delta on my journey to get here. They kept changing, all they did is make me less than 10 minutes late for every connecting flight. And it's so frustrating. They're like, apparently I said, hey, could you call them and tell them that, I'm almost there? And they said, we don't hold flights at Delta. And I was like, doesn't that make you a special person? So I'm finally here. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really happy to be here because I loved being here last year, and I love the people, I love the folks, I love what we talked about. And, really coming back and doing this here, we did a lot of presentation, me and Tia, last time. We talked a lot, and the hope was that this time we would talk some more, because I've done some more work to present things and frame things. By the way, how many people saw our presentations last year? Tia and myself. Okay, so a good amount of people. So I've added a number of other things. I think Jonathan Brack showed you some stuff earlier. But the hope with today is that we have a conversation that leads to creating tables to actually move some of these pieces. And it doesn't mean that coming immediately out of this, we get a list of things to do and then we run out and take to the streets. That's not the idea. But the idea is to focus on what a group this large that is tackling a different piece of the school to prison, cradle to prison pipeline, how we can all coordinate together in a coherent conversation over time. Okay, that's not going to work. Over months, over years, over the reality that this work takes a long time. But to galvanize us with some unifying themes, some unifying frameworks, so we can start playing from the same playbook. So that's the theory of today. So when we get to the end of this and we do some posting and some other things, our hope is that this just begins a conversation that we want to help you guys move forward. So just beware of that. But in terms of the substance, I wanted to ground us in some of the key ideas that we talked about last year with some new things that are added to the table, framing what the cradle to prison pipeline idea means, and also decomposing it into its pieces so we can think about how we take it on without taking on the whole beast. but how we take on each piece at a time. One of the things that I spent a lot of time talking about, I'm going to spend less time, but I'm going to still recover this area, is understanding some of the big structural changes that have produced intergenerational cycles of disadvantage and incarceration. Things that have reinforced the fact that we have very clear certain parts of our cities where the majority or a substantial share of the folks who live there suffer an intersection of very terrible adversities that start with concentration of poverty, that start with joblessness, but that brings in exposure to violence, involvement in violence, and ultimately pathways into the criminal justice system. So I want to reweave that story again before I start talking about what does taking that apart mean. So then I'm going to present the life course framework for improving the lives of disadvantaged populations, interrupting that cycle, but specifically interrupting the cradle to prison cycle that repeats itself through the exposure of the children to parents who are incarcerated and the subsequent consequences it has for their lives, which ultimately leads, sadly, to more incarceration. The first major structural shift that I talked about last time is declining male employment and earnings. And this is something that, is still an enormous problem, but fortunately the economy is moving in some positive ways right now. The hope is that it lasts. I absolutely don't think it will. I think maybe we have 1 or 2 more years left of this job growth that is allowing ex-felons to get jobs right now, that's allowing people who haven't been employed for years to actually find work these days. And it's not paying well. I'm not going to pretend that these are great jobs, but they're jobs. And that's happening right now, but in a couple years, that's probably going to peter out. And one of the things that we know that happens when the economy stalls is that African-American males, in particular, Latino males, native-born Latino males in particular, and Native American males are the first ones to get pushed out of those jobs when that happens. And so we have to confront the fact that we have opportunity right now, but there's a long structural trend line that tells us even if things are better right now, they're probably going to turn around in a few years and be worse all over again. This is the trend line in joblessness for African-American males from 1950 to 2010. And up there, that means that 2 out of 5 black males between the ages of 18 and 61 had no job at the height of the Great Recession, when we lost the most jobs in this country during that year. But the problem is, as I mentioned before, we've had 8 recessions from 1950 to 2010, and it never goes back to good. It never turns around. It stays on this secular trend. We go from boom to bust, but consistently the bust is more damaging for the next cohort of African-American males going forward. But the same thing also is showing up for native-born Latino males and for this group of white males who are seeing significant growth, substantially less than African-Americans and Latinos, but still showing a similar pattern of rising joblessness among men. But for the African-American community, it's acutely concentrated among men. And it's among men who don't go to college. It's just specifically that. That's the dividing line. If you look at the college age, those who actually attend college, these numbers are not only a lot smaller, they're a lot tighter together. The gaps are a lot smaller. The dividing line between essentially a lifetime of marginal connection to the labor market and all that comes with that is really a college degree. And it's not a surprise, I imagine, to people in this room, but that's the primary pathway right now to opportunity. It's not the primary pathway to terrible outcomes in life or terrible experiences in life. That pathway is dropping out of high school, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. The second major structural shift is the rise of mass incarceration. So this is what incarceration looked like for most of the 20th century. We had a fairly stable rate of incarceration until 1972, and then we lost our minds with respect to penal policy, and it produced one of the most unprecedented, in fact, the most unprecedented expansion in incarcerated populations in modern history. The only comparable example is the Russian Gulag system set up by Joseph Stalin in what became the Soviet Union. We increased our incarcerated population by 430%, largely because we wanted to. If you want to understand why it happened, we just decided to do this. And we decided, there are certain people who started the ball rolling on this conversation, Nixon being probably one of the most important examples. But sadly, everybody got in on the party, even black elected officials, even black mayors, even the Congressional Black Caucus. everybody got in on this idea that what was happening in black neighborhoods in the 1980s and 1990s, the best response to that was to lock people up. Not recognizing that Reagan and Nixon had just torn the safety net out from under all these communities by ending all these great society programs that had funded and supported these communities. When those fell away and something like crack cocaine came along, it was interpreted by all these legislators and policymakers that the only response to that is to put people away in prison for long amounts of time. So we changed, for example, the same crime that you might have committed here in the 60s or in the early 1970s, that crime that didn't get you time there now got you time after 1972. What that means is we changed a lot of what were misdemeanors to felonies. And then we passed what are called truth in sentencing laws and mandatory minimums that said, we basically took away the discretion from judges to give you the sentence they felt you deserved based upon the assessment of you as a person. What it said is that, and the theory and the irony here is that the proposal for mandatory minimums and truth in sentencing laws was to reduce racial bias by judges, because judges were basically handing out light sentences to white males and heavy sentences particularly to African American males. And so the theory was, if we pass these laws, we should see racial imbalances even out. Well, what happened is, once that discretion was taken away from judges, the discretion all fell to prosecutors. So prosecutors were the ones who decide who they would charge heavy and who they would charge light, and so the biases continued. It's just now the prosecutors were the ones doing it. And the prosecutors now are still the biggest part of this troubling story of mass incarceration, because we don't really have a way to control them. People talk about the fact that prosecutors are the most powerful agent in the criminal justice system, that even if we changed all the sentencing laws to say reduce them by an average of 5 years of time, that doesn't stop a prosecutor from now charging you with 5 of those charges so he can get the time he wants to give you. The prosecutors have too much power and discretion, and people are talking about how we change this, and when it turns out, mostly what we can do is to go and try and get progressive DAs to run against DAs in different counties. And we're seeing that play out across the country, but that's a slow-moving process. Everybody got on board with this agenda back in the day, and so a prosecutor couldn't get elected unless he said he wanted to put more people in prison than the last guy. Reversing that culture now is what a big challenge is. So why is incarceration so important? It's important because a felony conviction and/or imprisonment reduces your lifetime earnings and employment by 10 to 30% for the rest of your life. And we're talking about 10 to 30% off of someone's earnings who'd work at McDonald's or Walmart. We're talking about 10 to 30% off the wages of the working poor, not off an account. And what the implications of that are is that when you take away that amount of money from the working poor, you impoverish their children. This is ultimately about what happens to the next generation when these men cannot get work. Because the vast majority of men who go to prison, especially in their 20s, have children. And this becomes how this intergenerational cycle starts. It starts with the impoverishment of felony men, but it also starts with the relationships that develop and that they have and don't have with their children when they actually are officially incarcerated. What this means is that if we pass sentencing reform, and we decided, like in California, even though we didn't do it this big, but let's just say we wanted to let half of the prisoners out of prison right now. We sent half of them home. We'd have half as many prisoners, but we'd still have the same number of felons. Felonies are what drive the long-term joblessness and earnings consequences for their children, not the fact that men spent 1 year in prison versus 5 years in prison. It turns out the length of time you spend in prison doesn't really make that much of a difference in terms of what you'll earn after you get out. What makes the most difference is that you have the scarlet letter, that you have the felony conviction. And so we have to look at how big this problem really is. A recent study showed that basically 1 in 10 Americans living today have a felony conviction. And then 1 in 3 adult black males have a felony conviction. A third of black men have a felony conviction. I'm gonna just say that and just leave that as that. In Connecticut, 30% of African American adults have felony records. 9% of all adults have felony records. So the numbers are comparable to what we see nationally. We're seeing the same thing play out here in Connecticut. So the challenge for tackling the school to prison pipeline for the future is, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with the felony record stigma that stays with someone for their entire lives and undermines not only their ability to earn a living, find stable housing, address addiction issues that may be playing into their life, but impoverishing their children and leading to behavioral problems in their children? How we address this, some folks have said we do things like, we don't touch the felony, but we do ban the box. So we don't let employers see the felony, so hopefully people will get jobs. However, there are some problems with ban the box. How many people have encountered or heard of some of the problems with ban the box? Okay, just a couple folks. So some of the challenges with ban the box is that it actually can cause employers to discriminate against black males who don't have felony records. Let me re-explain. Ban the box operates on the assumption that racism is not real, unfortunately. And I state that, and I don't mean to be dismissive, but it operates on the idea that the reason people aren't being hired is not because of racism, but because they have a criminal record, and that criminal record makes employers a little bit nervous. So the theory is we take away the knowledge of the criminal record, and then they'll start hiring more black men as a result. Well, the reality is, nope. What they do is they assume all black men who apply have a criminal record and just discriminate against all black men. And this has been shown time and time again across all types of policies where you take information away from people who want to act discriminatorily. So another interesting finding is that in industries that drug test automatically, everybody gets drug tested, African American males are disproportionately likely to be employed. They're overrepresented in those types of jobs. Why would that be? That would be because black men can prove they're not drug addicts. If you can't show that you're not a criminal because they done ban the box and they don't look at your record, you can't prove you're not a criminal. And so these employers often will say, we're going to assume you are anyway. This is what's referred to as statistical discrimination. And I've seen this pattern replicated now across 5 different evaluation studies of ban the box. Ban the box is at its core a reasonably good idea. We just need to figure out how the policy is done correctly. In California, for example, we have some local ban the box stuff, but what we did was we said, how about we don't do ban the box? How about we get rid of the felony itself? How about we make the scarlet letter go away so we don't have to hide it from employers? And so through Prop 47, we allowed a very large number of people, and this was done retroactively, to apply if they haven't committed a certain number of felonies and the amount of felonies they committed. If they've only committed a certain type of felonies, what they call these non-nons, I won't get into it, but non-violent, non-sexual, non-something else felony. And if they have, there's a certain number of what would be called violent felonies that are allowed for inclusion under Prop 47. But what they do is they basically go to a judge and they say, I want to apply under Prop 47 to have these felony charges recalled and all turned into misdemeanors. And in the state of California, you can legally expunge misdemeanors. You can get them off your record and they go away. So we did this at a state level, at a very mass level, and we got a lot of people who actually got rid of felony records altogether. They no longer have the scarlet letter. In my opinion, this is the direction to go. This is the way to go if we're really going to address that scarlet letter, is to remove it. Because most other efforts to try and mitigate its effects or hide it from the people that might discriminate with it, they find ways around it and it ends up harming other parties, unfortunately. So bear that in mind as part of this criminal justice reform conversation that ultimately is going to bear on the cradle to prison pipeline. So when we look at this scale of incarceration that began in the 1970s and just reached its peak around 2009, 2010, what did we get for that? We got this. This really tall yellow bar here means that 70% of black males who drop out of high school will go to prison in their lifetimes. 70%. In the state where I come from, it's 90%. You're almost virtually guaranteed to go to prison as a black male if you drop out of high school. But look at this number. Oops. 21%. You only have a 21% chance of going to prison in your lifetime if you're a black male who gets a high school diploma or a GED. So for black males specifically, education is literally a ticket out of prison. And high school is the defining line between the education that gets you out of prison. College is also important, but we can see here that college doesn't completely protect you from going to prison for a black male. But the gap between high school dropout and high school diploma, if I were to bet my money and my time and my effort on trying to interrupt the cradle to prison pipeline, it would start here. Crossing that high school diploma finish line seems crucially important. Now, I got in a debate with this conservative guy about, well, he said that, well, this is not a causal thing. The evidence is not causal that if you graduate from high school, that causally reduces your likelihood of going to prison. And I said, actually, evidence strongly suggests that that is. We can't randomly assign people to drop out of school and see if they go to prison. So we can't do a randomized controlled trial. But we can look at what are called quasi-experiments or natural experiments. And one natural experiment that was conducted through the 70s and 80s is that we changed the age of compulsory education. Used to be like 14 or 15, and we changed it to, I think, 17 or 18 across states. And different states did it at different times. And so we were able to see when a state raised its age of schooling for kids, what effect did it have on their crime rates and incarceration rates? And we found, remarkably, that when kids stay in school longer, they're less likely to go to prison. But when they stay in school longer to get that terminal degree, the thing that says they are now eligible to remain in society, because there's no two markers that tell somebody that you're more locked out of society than ever, and that's being a high school dropout with no diploma or having a felony conviction. In this day and age, those two things essentially are, our society has agreed to say to people because of all the avenues we've closed off, if you got those two things, you don't get to participate in America anymore. You can do some things here and there, but pretty much you're no longer part of the body politic of America. That's where we are in this day and age, and so that's why this dividing line matters so much. That's why that high school diploma matters so much for your likelihood of going to prison. The third major structural shift, that's the linchpin that makes this intergenerational, is the rise of what I call incarcerated families. And by that I mean that when a father is incarcerated, because in most cases, the person who's incarcerated who's a parent is a father, but mothers are also being incarcerated in more frequent numbers, and the numbers of incarceration among African American women are higher than anybody. They actually rival incarceration rates among white men. But when someone's incarcerated in a family, it incarcerates the whole family. The whole family is now part of and under the thumb of the system. From the costs associated with calling home that comes out of the family budget that for the foreseeable future is going to remain this exorbitant costs that are imposed by these private companies for people to be able to talk to their loved ones. The separation of fathers from their children, the fact that as soon as someone gets incarcerated, if they're married, the probability of divorce is like 50 or 60% because of the separation from a spouse. Also because of conflicts that emerge around the re-entering spouse now that they've got a felony conviction. How are we going to manage the bills? When are you going to get a job? You know, I can't afford to take care of you living here too and our children. Those types of things become part of the conversation. So the rise of incarcerated families is about how the criminal justice system doesn't just incarcerate people, it incarcerates the families of whole communities and undermines their well-being. So what is the level of incarceration of families? And by this, I'm going to talk about this in terms of the percentage of children who have incarcerated fathers on any given day. Basically, 11.4% of all African American children have a father incarcerated on any given day, 1 in 10 children, roughly. And then 1.75 of white children have a father incarcerated on any given day. Unfortunately, I don't have data for Latinos or Native Americans, but they're going to be somewhere in the middle, probably closer to what we see for the white population. But we know it's not just about whether your father's incarcerated on any given day, it's whether your father is ever incarcerated throughout your childhood. Because all it takes is one felony. It can happen when you're 3, it can happen when you're 7, or when you're 14. It's going to matter a lot for your life if your father is incarcerated. So what is the cumulative risk of a child's father's incarceration by their 14th birthday? For all fathers who are African American, 25% of children in this country, African American children in this country, have a father who's incarcerated by the time they're 14 years old. It's 3.6% for white children. And then these are black fathers who've dropped out of high school. 51% of children whose father is African American has dropped out of high school will have a father who's incarcerated. And if you looked at the last data point on the risk of going to prison for black males who drop out of high school, this all makes sense. And the rate is 7.2% for white children. So what this means is that the reproduction of educational outcomes, meaning the children of parents who drop out of high school often are at very high risk of dropping out of high school. It's a cycle that repeats itself. But in the past 40 years, we've thrown in the mix of incarceration now. So those children are now exposed to not only a parent who's dropped out of high school and is poor, but a father who is incarcerated and enmeshed in the criminal justice system. This is where the cradle to prison pipeline starts. It starts in the exposure of these children to their father's incarceration or their mother's incarceration. But this is the beginning of it, and it's been reproducing itself as a cycle for decades now. So when we think about what you saw earlier as the pipeline, just know that before that pipeline begins is a story where that same story played out in another generation and another generation before it. So what we're trying to do is not just break the cycle of incarceration in this present generation, we're trying to mitigate the effects of what the last generation has experienced that produces this cycle and try and prevent it from passing on to the next generation of children. We're trying to break an intergenerational cycle when we think about this pipeline, not just an individual life pipeline. So what are the consequences of paternal incarceration for children? Incarceration of fathers increases their sons' aggression by 18 to 33% compared to boys whose fathers are not incarcerated. Aggression is the #1 factor behind behavioral problems in schools, depending on the regime. If you we have willful defiance as a category, depending on how much the disciplinary policies within schools is targeted to actual behavior that is likely to be harmful to other kids versus something that's called willful defiance, which is often used as a reason to push kids out of class or to lead to suspensions and so forth. But when we look at the behavior that actually is strongly undermining of kids' outcomes in schools and beyond that, it's what's called externalizing behavior that is the most at risk, because it not only affects their engagement at school, it not only affects their interaction with teachers and other authorities, it affects their interaction with their peers. And those peer interactions from early on to well into adolescence are the things that are most likely to predict juvenile delinquency, involvement in crime, and involvement in crime as an adult. They also strongly predict dropping out of high school. So this is one mechanism by which a father's incarceration passes directly to their sons, in this case, leading them on then the pathway to incarceration for themselves. Parental incarceration is associated with a 21% increase in learning disabilities. Because schools and completion of schooling all the way through high school is protective against incarceration, anything that makes a child perform less or disengage from school raises their risk of incarceration, especially if their parents are poor, if they live in a single-parent family, in a high-poverty neighborhood, and their father, as you can see here, has been incarcerated. Parental incarceration is associated with a 41% increase in ADD and ADH symptoms, especially among boys. And this is strongly predictive of educational outcomes. These are some of the baseline mechanisms by which the cradle to prison pipeline repeats itself across generations. It starts by influencing these early behavioral trajectories and academic trajectories of young children in schools that then lead them to disengage from schools, possibly find a pathway through juvenile justice outcomes to eventually being incarcerated as an adult. But most of how this happens is they progressively disengage from and drop out of high school. They don't then go get a job, they become disconnected youth. Disconnected youth who then are the right candidates for not only going to prison, but are also the core candidates for a great deal of the violence, individual and group violence that takes place in our communities. So we take those big shifts and we have to look at the fact that they're not just spread all over our geography, they are concentrated in specific neighborhoods. And out here in Hartford, you guys know what those neighborhoods are. Out in Oakland where I live, I know exactly where the neighborhoods are, where this process is playing out. It's stuck in place because of the concentration of mass incarceration. We looked at the declining employment and earnings among males over the past 50 years. We talked about how mass incarceration and the war on drugs has contributed directly to that declining in employment and earnings. Both of these factors have driven the rise of incarcerated families, and incarcerated families undermine the educational trajectories of their children, limits their employment opportunities, and puts them on this similar cycle of starting this process all over again with the next generation of children. And this has been happening for decades now. This has been going on. That's one of the reasons why people say that mass incarceration is kind of like global warming. Even if we stopped it today, its consequences are probably going to last for the next 30 or 40 years, because it's going to continue to affect children that are already in the cycle, and their children subsequently that are already in the cycle. And so if we stop greenhouse gases today, we're still going to be really hot in a few decades. It's an unavoidable reality. And so I want you to think about mass incarceration like that, is that even if we announce a massive package of criminal justice reforms, sentencing reforms, we still have the reality that these collateral consequences have already been intergenerationally embedded and are going to continue. So how we interrupt them has to require ultimately more than just programs. It has to require policy, but specific types of both of those things. This intergenerational cycle is concentrated. So this is a segregation map of Hartford. I don't know if you guys have seen this. If you go to a place called the Cooper Center, they allow you to do dot maps of segregation of cities, and it's illuminating. I mean, you can read all kinds of different segregation indices for a city or a metropolitan area, but nothing really tells you segregation like looking at this. The orange dots are Latinos, the green dots are African Americans, and the blue dots are white folks, and the red dots are Asian folks. Asians are quite sprinkled around with some concentrations. I don't know where this is, but that's a nice concentration of Asian folks. But I can bet these are the historical ghettos of Hartford without knowing anything about the city of Hartford. Does anybody know these geographies by looking at this map? Are these places consistent with long-standing, high-poverty areas of Hartford? Can't see. So there's a lot of orange and some green here. There's orange and some green here. And then there's a lot more green and orange up there. So a lot more African Americans up here in this area. And you can see that it's pretty segregated. It's pretty densely segregated. There are pockets out here of other places of blacks and Latinos, but these are the historical core, it looks like, of what would be considered high poverty neighborhoods or ghettos over the past 30 or 40 years. Well, we'll figure out how to send you a link, or go to Cooper Center and actually play with it and look at different parts, because you can go into different levels of granularity. But this is so much more revealing, because the thing is, you can look at this photo and compare your city to, Selma, Alabama, or to Baltimore, or to Detroit. And the amazing thing is that you'll look at these cities that have wildly different levels of segregation according to the indexes, but they don't look that different when you look at the dots. It's amazing how much segregation, when you look at the dots, looks very strong and robust still across the country, even though it's been declining over the years. But it's in these neighborhoods that this intergenerational cycle is unfolding. It wasn't until the 1970s for the first time that we saw the rise in what's called concentrated poverty neighborhoods. Neighborhoods in which the majority of men specifically are jobless. And we're talking about percentages that are sometimes 70, 80, 90% of the men in the neighborhood don't have work. When you get that level of joblessness, and an important thing to note about male joblessness, and I make the distinction, that in the 1970s, 1980s, and part of the 1990s, whether a neighborhood had high levels of poverty was dependent on the employment of males. how many males were employed and what they were earning drove what we would define as the poverty in that neighborhood. That's not the same way anymore. What drives the poverty in a neighborhood is how many women are employed and what they earn, not what men earn. So we now define women are the economic earning foundation of neighborhoods, and they shape the threshold of what falls below the poverty line or above the poverty line for a neighborhood. But when it does fall below, and the threshold that we typically use is 30 to 40% poverty. When a neighborhood hits for the first time, for example, 20% poverty in that neighborhood, it starts to show some cracks. We start to see things like crime rates go up. We start to see disorder in the neighborhood, meaning abandoned things, broken things, theft, stuff like that happens. You start to see decay in institutions. And then it progressively increases and gets worse as the percentage level goes up from 21 to 24 to 25 to 26 to 30. Still continues to get worse all the way up to 40%. But once it hits 40%, it just plateaus. It doesn't really get any worse. So neighborhoods on most indicators that are 40% poor or 60% poor, they tend to look very much the same. So the theory is that when neighborhoods get between 20 and 40%, is when the danger starts to happen and neighborhoods turn over into places that become very hostile to the development of kids. They become undermined because they experience economic decline. Well, some pieces are missing there. Racial and economic segregation. When that happens, the schools decline in quality. The people who have higher incomes move out. Drugs become more prominent. Business and government start to disinvest from the community. All these things unfold once a certain poverty level is reached. And then the neighborhood kind of gets thrown away. It kind of turns over and becomes this kind of locked, fixed place, stuck in place, as Patrick Sharkey calls it, of disadvantage. These are also the places from which our imprisoned population overwhelmingly comes from. Starting in the 1980s, 1990s, we shifted policing in America in a fundamental way to what's called zero tolerance policing or broken windows policing, or the type of stuff that was pioneered in New York City with stop and frisk and other types of invasive policing mechanisms. It used to be in the 1950s and 60s, police didn't spend too much time policing in black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. That wasn't the priority. It was keeping black and Latinos out of the wrong neighborhoods. So you were more likely to run into a cop because you were walking in the wrong neighborhood, not because you were walking in your black neighborhood. But that shifted when the war on drugs happened, because now police had a very strong rationale and motive to go into black neighborhoods very invasively, to treat everybody who lives in a particular neighborhood as if they're a criminal because that neighborhood has a high amount of drugs and a high amount of crime. And this became the socialization of young men. Growing up as teenagers, they became socialized to seeing the police as inherently illegitimate because they're only there to enforce oppression around drugs, but not really to protect them. You're not my police, you're somebody else's police here to police me. And that socialization has an effect. It erodes the legitimacy of policing, it erodes the legitimacy of the criminal justice system in the development of young people. There are alternatives to that approach, and we're exploring them now. Legitimacy policing, actually making community-centered policing an effective and a real application in life. But the shift to this type of policing really undermined not only communities, but it undermined the community's safety. We know that, I don't know how many know that, so most homicides, most murders are solved based on tips. In fact, 99-something% of murders that happen in a community are solved because someone called the police and said, this dude did it. And if you watch First 48, which I don't encourage you if you don't like movies about people being murdered, I happen to like seeing how they catch people. And the overwhelming way they catch people is not they call in CSI and they find a hair glowing in the corner and they grab that and they run the DNA and they track a guy down because he ate a popsicle up the street. That's not how they catch people. They catch people because someone calls and said, this dude by this street name is the guy that did it according to the neighborhood, and they go pick the guy up and they make him confess, or they try and get him to confess. And they have a really good track record of confessing on that show. What started to happen in the 1960s and 70s and 80s is that clearance rates for homicides started to plummet because people stopped talking to the police. Those tips stopped happening, so police couldn't make the arrest and arrest people. So, for example, in places like, there's a great book whose name is not immediately coming to me, Ghetto Side, about Los Angeles. Incredible book about how the police just, if you're a black male who gets shot in a certain part of town, they don't really put that much time into trying to find your killer. They're just like, yeah, nobody's going to tell us nothing, so the cops give up. They don't really invest any time because of the years of LAPD essentially eroding the relationship with people where they weren't getting tips anymore. No one would tell them who killed anybody. And the way that the law enforcement referred to this is that this no-snitch culture is taking over, and so because of that, we can't go out and prosecute these people. No, no-snitch didn't start in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. That was people saying, these police aren't really here to protect us. And so they stopped reporting to police and stopped giving police information. There's still a good amount of information given to police, but the police get a lot less information than they used to from black communities. So in the city of Los Angeles, even in the city of Oakland, you have a 1 in 2 chance of killing someone and getting away with it. And by the way, we're talking about clearance by arrest. We're not talking about clearance by conviction. The conviction rate for murders in Oakland is less than 25%. So that means 75% of the murders that are committed, the person gets away with them. So why wouldn't people keep committing murders if that were the case? This reinforces this destabilizing lack of safety in these communities because this reality exists. And it exists because of the erosion of trust, not because people don't just want to snitch. It's because this is a long-standing dynamic. Yes, sir.
Community member, you want to do the right thing. You want to
That's right.
Right? As a snitch, you're involved in the crime. All right, so we need to start changing that language as well.
I agree 100%. And you know, it's, the police are the ones that say this no snitch problem is the reason. That's actually police language. Someone raised, yes ma'am.
Is that color on color crime, or is that any kind of crime? If I'm a black man, I kill a white person, is it the same?
Oh no, you're going to jail.
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. Where you were saying.
Yes, no, if a black man kills a black man, specifically,
all right.
the probability of arrest or conviction is extremely low, sadly, of the amount of murders that occur.
Okay, but if I kill a white dude, they own me.
Oh, they're on you. They're on you. That's right. So mass incarceration is concentrated in these neighborhoods where this intergenerational cycle is happening because of the exposure to paternal incarceration, because of weak and decaying schools, because of years of disinvestment, because of the concentration of poverty, which is a function of declining manufacturing mixed with economic and racial segregation. Here's a photo of incarceration in New York City. You can see where the people are coming from. So this is basically the Flatbush center of Brooklyn, and up there is the West Bronx. And that's the core of where incarceration happens in New York City. And there are places, if you go different cities, you go to Houston, you go to Oakland, you go to different places, you see the same level of concentration. There's only a small number of places in which we are taking our incarcerated population out. And so that level of men coming out of these neighborhoods is a structurally destabilizing force. It undermines the community. It not only bridges this connection from the prison to the neighborhood, so neighborhood dynamics are affected so much by what's going on in prisons, but because of the absence and the volatility of men, boys in those neighborhoods are particularly affected by its effect on role modeling, the types of ideologies with respect to police and schooling that emerge in these neighborhoods. They're heavily affected by what's happening in prisons and how prisons are designing and dividing up the turf of prison life. So these are the structural pieces that come together to produce this intergenerational cycle of imprisonment. The life course framework, as I showed it before, is how we take some of the key pieces of this cycle and we look at them. Now, these are the key pieces of the framework, and then I'm going to apply it to the cycle. But I want to just put these ideas out there because they raise different implications for how we think of intervention. There are three key pieces of the life course framework. The first are what are called dimensions of human development. These are the things that we start with in our lives, like our genetics, and the things that develop over our lives, our physical health, our cognitive development, our mental health, our socio-emotional skills as examples. But think of these things as the embodied things, the internal things, the things that become represented in us, and that are a function of exposures and experiences we have over our lives. These get shaped by that stuff. They get shaped by those environmental experiences and how we respond to those experiences. Then we have our life course outcomes, which are heavily influenced by our dimensions of development, human development, but have a feedback loop. And these are the institutional competency milestones, credentials in some cases, that are tied to specific age spans, like school readiness, high school graduation, incarceration, and so forth. Life course outcomes are distinctive in that they are tied to an institutional framework or response. Meaning, if I commit the exact same auto theft when I'm 15 versus when I'm 22, it has radically different implications for how society responds. If I commit auto theft when I'm 16, I might get 6 months. If it's a first offense, I might get 6 months probation, depending on the jurisdiction and the temperament of the prosecutor. But if I'm 23, I'll get 6 years. Because society has made a decision that those are two different things when a kid steals a car versus when an adult steals a car. Failing to graduate from high school doesn't just represent the lack of skills that you've obtained. It literally is a very hard barrier that says there's a whole bunch of things now you can't participate in society unless you get that diploma. You can't go on to college, you can't go on to any other pathways until you get that diploma. And you got to get these grades. These aren't just a reflection of the abilities that we've developed at different points in time, but how society responds to the development of those abilities. How society has created bottlenecks and gates that you have to jump through to get to where you're going. These are closely related, but these are often societally imposed as categories of things you're supposed to do. You can't go to the second grade unless you pass the first grade. You can't go to the fourth grade unless you pass the third grade. If you don't, you get retained, you get grade retention, you get held back. That's an institutional response to what is a competency deficit. But that's one institutional response. We could give you more supports to allow you to be prepared to go on with your classmates to the next grade, but we often don't do that. We have made an institutional decision that, no, we're going to keep you back, and then we reproduce the likelihood that you're going to drop out of school as a consequence of being retained in school. And then there are ecological contextual factors. These are the environmental and experiential factors that interact with each other, but shape both dimensions of human development and life course outcomes, our families, our neighborhoods, our schools, our public systems. Many of the things I've been talking about up till now. Structural forces are often the things that become ecological contextual factors. And what they do is they shape patterns of human development and they shape patterns of life outcomes. But there's a feedback loop between all three of these as a person moves across their life course. In terms of dimensions of human development, everything on this slide that's separated by a comma is from a study or studies that says these things predict those life course outcomes that were over here. They predict whether or not you graduate from high school, whether you're employed by the time you're 40, whether or not you can read on grade level in the third grade. We have here physical health, cognitive development, mental health and sense of well-being, socio-emotional development, identity development, declarative and procedural content and cultural knowledge, meaning-making, spiritual development, moral development, and personality. These are all from the literature that says these things predict life course outcomes. Now, because our conference today and our framework today is focused on adolescence through emerging adulthood, I want to generally highlight what the evidence says are the types of dimensions of human development we should be targeting if we want to influence the outcomes, the life course outcomes of adolescents and young adults. And what's very clear from the research is that we should be influencing mental health and sense of well-being, socio-emotional development, identity development, and meaning-making spiritual development to influence outcomes for adolescents. Now, when we're dealing with young children, things like physical health, cognitive development, these are much more important. Teaching kids how to read and write, do math is much more important. But those academic or cognitive-focused efforts for adolescents are much less effective. They're much less likely to alter a trajectory. But what is likely to alter a trajectory are mental health things like helping them regulate emotion, helping them respond to exposure to trauma, to heal from trauma, which lurks as the biggest boogeyman, I think, behind so many other experiences that we see here. Socio-emotional development about sense of autonomy, self-monitoring, metacognition. Identity development relates squarely to this notion of mindsets, self-concepts, helping children establish a different type of academic self-concept. And I'm going to give you an example from a program I work with in Los Angeles called the Social Justice Learning Institute. What's remarkable about this program is called the Urban Scholars Program, and it works exclusively with probation-involved black males in South Los Angeles. It used to be called South Central Los Angeles. Now it's called South Los Angeles. And the program is remarkable because what he has these kids do who are often behind academically, they're undercredited, they're on the precipice of dropping out, they're on probation for some felony violation, that's usually a violent offense, and he has them read postmodern social theorists. He has them read Derrida and I'm forgetting some of the names, but these people that you only come across in college, and they're far too esoteric for most people to even tolerate. And he has these kids read this stuff. He has them to understand how oppression is embedded in how their school operates. How oppression is embedded and why your school is in this part of town. Why so many people in your neighborhood smoke crack cocaine, for example. He has them use these postmodern social theorists to go around and actively deconstruct, which is a term from these postmodern theorists, why their neighborhood is the way it is, why their schools operate the way it is. In other words, he gives them immediate, practical, kind of social thought that helps explain the world around them to themselves. And they feel like scholars because of their ability to do this, irrespective of whether or not they're getting good grades in class, or whether their teacher says they're smart. They feel this new academic self-concept that's built around, I can understand how the ghetto works socially, social analytically. And the funny thing is that when these kids have this academic self-concept, when they develop it, they start to do better in school because they want to take it further. They start to do better in their math and English work. They start to have better relationships with their teachers and their peers. It's not rocket science when a child or a young person, especially an adolescent, feels that they are getting the type of understanding on the world that can garner them respect and prestige, and also give them the ability to see why their lives matter and their lives around them matter. It's not hard to see why that would make them want to invest in doing better in school and in not recidivating in juvenile justice and so forth. Much of what drives adolescence is the desire to matter, the desire to establish respect. That's why they strive so hard to do it amongst their peers, even often at the detriment of their future opportunities. Their identity is crucial to how they see themselves and how they thrive. And so our efforts should be on socio-emotional development, should be on using cognitive behavioral therapeutic methods to confront trauma. And so when you're looking at black males, Latino males living in high poverty, disadvantaged neighborhoods, identity is probably the most important fulcrum for changing their opportunities and trajectories, not tutoring them, frankly, in English and math or college visits. We'll come back to this question, but I want to intentionally provoke you with what the evidence thematically says about what works for these young men in these environments. You can imagine all these things separated by commas being like slides on an equalizer like this. And this is the capsule of us as a human being. And when we start our lives, some of the things about us may be at the top. So we'll call those protective factors, aspects of who we are. We're really smart, so our cognitive development is a protective factor. Kids who have strong cognitive skills early on in life tend to do better, even if they have other deficits that happen to them along the way. Risk factors can start early too. These early exposures, like being exposed to severe trauma while in the womb, becomes a very significant physical health risk factor that looms large over the life course. Think of this as a capsule of a human being, a capsule of the you, a capsule of me. When we start our life as our capsule of a human being, as us, moves across our life course, different aspects of who we are become sensitive, become plastic, And they start moving in a protective or a risk direction, mostly depending on what's happening around us. So if we're exposed to severe violence, domestic violence in the household at a young age, it has severe effects that start to shape all of these more towards a risk direction going forward. But if we experience nothing but positive experiences, nothing but nurturing developmental experiences, many of our slides might be at the top and be operating in a protective direction as we move across our life course. But depending on what happens to you, the equalizer you started with as a child could look very different by the time you're 35 years old. If you've been to war, for example, and seen a lot of people killed and had to kill a lot of people, what your equalizer looks like over here could be very different from what you started with wherever you came from as a child. This is the life course canvas. This is where you might have seen the school to prison pipeline that we talked about earlier. What we look at on this canvas are the key life course outcomes that accumulate towards some long-term result. The way we've designed this particular slide is what are the life course outcomes, either on track or off track, that puts you on track or off track to reaching middle class by the time you're in your mid to late 30s. And what we mean by middle class in a technical sense is that you're in the third quintile of the income distribution, but we also say it's 300% federal poverty level, give or take. That's about how we operationalize middle class. 300% what a federal poverty level would be for a family of four, which, as I understand it, is somewhere around $70-something thousand on a national basis. We're defining that as middle class. So what outcomes do you need to be on track to achieve that end result? And what outcomes make it very unlikely that you'll ever make it there? These are age spans that organize the research literature: early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and emerging adulthood, which is where we're focused in this conference today, and then early adulthood. And there are ecological contextual factors. We're not going to go into these for lack of time, but some of the most important, if not the most important, are family, schools and childcare, peers, mentors, and networks, the place that you live and where you spend time, institutions and public systems, and then society and culture and history. And those are nested within each other. But let's look at the life course outcomes, because these life course outcomes are really the rubric that sets up the conversation about the cradle to prison pipeline and what it means to interrupt that in adolescence. A life course outcome right out the gate that puts you off track to being middle class by the time you're 30 or 40 is being born preterm or low birth weight. This drags on your life chances well into your 40s if you're born low birth weight or preterm. Attends pre-K, does not attend pre-K. Securely attached to a primary caregiver, insecurely attached. How many people don't know what secure attachment means? Wow, this is amazing. Okay, one person. Okay, I'll just quickly say what secure attachment means, just so everybody is on the same page. But secure attachment refers to the relationship established between a child and their primary caregiver, such that, and the notion of secure attachment is often operationalized or defined as a child has a relationship that's very close, robust, with a parent, that when that parent should leave or be out of the room, the child can cope effectively with the parent or with that primary caregiver being gone. The child can interact with other folks. They can explore things on their own. And the basic thing is that they're confident, they're not fearful, they're confident without their primary caregiver there, because their primary caregiver has done a job for them, which is to respond to them consistently in what's called this serve and return relationship of helping them to emotionally regulate, of helping them deal with anxiety. But basically, the parent emotionally regulates the child, and when their child is securely attached, they can emotionally regulate themselves. And the reason this is important is because when children start to go into peer environments like elementary school, like kindergarten, their ability to emotionally regulate themselves is crucial for them to have peer relationships that are productive, healthy, and important. If they are insecurely attached, they often will interact in those peer relationships by showing aggression or by showing withdrawal or different types of behaviors that undermine peer relationships going forward. This becomes an early precursor and template for everything from dating partners to married partners to relationships with children. So this is not just a small matter of this relationship with this primary caregiver. People talk about this as an evolutionary necessity for young people to be able to adapt in relationships with others across their entire lifetime. School ready, cognitive and social emotional skills in kindergarten, not school ready as the off-track outcome. Proficient fourth grade math and reading and socio-emotional skills, not proficient in fourth grade math and reading and socio-emotional skills. Proficient good grades, most particularly 8th grade math and English middle school grades. What's the grade they get in those core grades? And it can also be extended to the 9th grade. 8th grade and 9th grade grades in math or English are extremely predictive of likelihood of dropping out of high school and likelihood of completing college. Chronically absent from school, which is usually defined as missing 10% or more of the school year days. Behavior problems and discipline, specifically and especially antisocial behavior and violence that leads to suspensions and expulsions. Juvenile delinquency, especially violence, arrest, detention, recidivism. Criminal offending, especially violence, arrest, felony conviction, incarceration, and recidivism. School mobility, changing schools multiple times in a school year or across multiple school years. Grade retention, being held back a grade. High school graduation, not college and career ready, because high schools really don't equip very well for career ready, but they do more so for college, or being a high school dropout. College enrollment, college completion from a four-year college, or being a college dropout. A post-secondary credential, usually an AA degree. Disconnected from school and work, the population 16 to 24 years old, neither working or in school, and I further circumscribe that to those who do not have a high school diploma. Because we just saw the 30-year-old guy evicted from his parents' house. You guys hear this story? He's not disconnected youth, so he doesn't fall in that category. That guy is just something, a bum. Yeah, bum is the word. Violence, victimization, or untreated substance abuse or behavioral health problem. Stable housing, housing instability or homelessness. Stable full-time employment, long-term unemployment or underemployment greater than 6 months. And then the Sentinel outcome, the North Star goal. Stable full-time employment at 30% federal poverty level or middle-class earnings by the time you're in your 30s. And then earning below federal poverty level. So by the way, you guys are all going to get this slide deck, just so you know. I don't know if that was said earlier, but we're going to distribute it out. You can certainly reach out to me to get it, and I'll put my email address up at the end. But all of you are going to have this going forward for this conversation. So within this outcome list, we mapped, and you saw this earlier, the Cradle to Prison pipeline. And we should know that up here, from an ecological contextual standpoint, being in a family that's poor, that's a single-parent family with parents who are high school dropouts and a father who's been incarcerated is the core transmission families of this intergenerational cycle. Meaning it's these families where the likelihood of going to prison is a majority outcome, not a minority outcome, where it happens more often than it doesn't happen. And then the outcome pathways that you get there are through these means. You start from that disadvantaged family environment, and then you start off not ready for school, both in terms of cognitive skills and socio-emotional skills. This raises the risk of juvenile arrest, of being delinquent, being arrested or detained as a result, of being chronically absent from school, of failing math or English in the 8th or 9th grade, and of showing behavioral problems, particularly during late elementary, middle school, and high school. And these all point to high school dropout as the core intervening mechanism by which juvenile delinquency and school negative outcomes lead to mass incarceration. They all tend to run through not finishing that degree. If all of these things happened and you still graduated from high school, it has a strong probability of interrupting your trajectory towards imprisonment. So high school graduation is more than, I say high school graduation is really not an opportunity outcome. Because just getting people to graduate from high school doesn't really do that much for them, unless they do something else after high school. What it does is it protects you from the off-track outcomes. Graduating from high school keeps you out of prison. It won't put you in a $100,000 a year job, but it'll keep you out of an 8x10. So that's how high school graduation should be seen. A college degree is the thing that, or some type of post-secondary pathway, is how you're going to get to the middle class. But graduating from high school is a critical pathway to not ending up in prison. High school dropout, the #1 predictor of going to prison. And then once in prison, or as an independent factor, untreated substance abuse or behavioral health problem. A large majority, I'm pretty sure it's a majority of males who are incarcerated in prison have a substance abuse problem, and a long-standing substance abuse problem. So this can be its own independent pathway. You could graduate from high school but find your way into a substance abuse problem, and that could be its own pathway into imprisonment. But what happens next is, what happens when you're released? This is the second cycle. This is the recidivism cycle of continuously returning to prison. Housing instability or homelessness after you're released from incarceration. Long-term unemployment or underemployment greater than 6 months. The lockout of the labor market. All of these things, including untreated substance abuse, contribute to recidivism. And this lives as a cycle. This lives as a cycle. Generally speaking, if you look at the age distribution over time of men who commit felony convictions, it peaks in the early 20s, mid-20s, and then right around the 30s, it just starts to progressively decline. In the 30s, the mid to late 30s, most men who committed crimes when they're younger stop. They stop going to prison. And so this cycle continues to repeat and unfold until about the mid to late 30s, and then it just becomes a lifetime of being locked out of the labor market or locked into low earnings. They're no longer going into the prison system, but now their children, who by this time are in their early, between the 12 and 18 years old, their children are starting to go into the prison system themselves. So this is what the pipeline looks like. This is how it unfolds in a single lifetime, and these outcomes, in particular, is how it transmits to the next generation and becomes this story up here for their child. Now, what we asked you guys to do over there in terms of this conversation was to talk about what piece would you all take on here? Would you take on the chronic absence as a factor in high school dropout, connecting those two things as an area of intervention? And I know you probably have some work, you probably have some ideas, there are probably things brewing on the ground with respect to that. We want to know actually what that is, to be thoughtful about that and create a container, a table, or some continuing ongoing dialogue about this piece of the work that needs to happen and who are the constituencies around it that are going to do it. There could be failing these grades to high school dropout, which brings in questions of how do you remediate or deal with undercrediting for kids to graduate from high school. Juvenile detention, arrest and detention, and its effect on high school. A lot of this has to do with how do you get kids back in school and wanting to be back in school after they've been arrested or after they've been detained. That's usually the biggest challenge. Now, a lot of what this work is about is what I call building recovery pathways. Okay, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let me just tell you that, the data I pulled on some of these. I wanted to pull some Hartford data to fill out this picture a bit so you guys could see what some of these numbers say. In Fresno County in California, I went through for the county and we pulled numbers on every single one of these things. They have a data system that they're going to update annually that tells them what all these numbers are doing and what they're doing for African American, Latino, Native American, and white kids. And so they're using that as a tracking system to guide policy, strategy, and program going forward. And it's not that it was very simple to do, but it wasn't hard. And so I bet that if you all started with the process of actually figuring out what your numbers are doing, because we know the literature says this is the pathway, but you might find our chronic absence has plummeted over the past 4 years. We shouldn't be putting our effort there because something is working in our favor. We should be putting our effort into these other categories where the numbers aren't doing as well, for example. Or we should be thinking about the relationship between this direct relationship and criminal offending. And because we're today focused on adolescence beyond, we know a lot of early childhood stuff is going to matter in shaping these outcomes. That part of the conversation should also be here at some point in this, what I would consider a collective impact, collective pipeline approach. But the reality is the data is going to tell you where the fire is burning, and you should focus your efforts, where you should call all the fire trucks. So the data is very useful, and Fresno, because of the work I've done with them, was able to do that. But I just wanted to show you what we see here on the suspensions and expulsions, 2016-17 data from Hartford Public Schools. 13.8% for Latinos, 17.5% for blacks, and then 6.2% for whites. I don't know if anybody knows these numbers like the back of their hand and say there are problems with them or anything like that. I didn't really assess them in any more detail but what was publicly reported. But this was an interesting level of data on that scale of suspensions and expulsions. What really shook me when I looked at this number is the chronic absence rates. Latinos at 28% chronic absence, is that right? Does anybody know if that's right? I know that's what it said in the data, but that just seems stunningly high. I've never seen that high. Okay. Well, one of the things I inferred here is that part of this might be undocumented kids. Is that possible? Is that a possibility as a factor? Or has this number been high for a while? Yes, sir.
It might be, I think that the demographics here are different than when you leave the tri-state area with regard to immigrants. I think most of our folks are, the majority of our population here in Hartford is Puerto Rican, automatic citizenship.
Got it.
So that's a different kind of demographic, although we do have an influx of groups that are coming in that may not be documented, which is kind of just a new thing in Hartford. As far as the breakdown of races, it does seem pretty accurate. We are presently at about 25% chronically absent kids. We're up about 3% compared to last year at the same time last year, and our population is 10% white, 50% Hispanic, 40% black, a little bit of Asian sprinkled in there. But yeah, that's pretty accurate as far as our demographics. So they are proportionate.
Great, thank you. So that clearly shows that there's a fire burden here. There's definitely a fire burden in chronic absence. Preventatively, that is a primary place. And the evidence shown consistently across studies is that this is one of the strongest predictors of high school dropout there is. And it starts in the fifth or sixth grade, it starts being predictive of high school dropout 5 or 6 years later. So that's an important area of focus. The high school dropout, this is actually should be high school graduation data, I'm sorry, but the Latino high school graduation numbers are pretty stunningly low. They look like what I would expect to see for African Americans in places like Detroit or Baltimore, where I've actually seen those numbers. And so, but based upon what Mario just said, if it's the Puerto Rican population and Dominican population, a lot of those numbers look just like what African Americans numbers look like in different places. And so maybe that's a reflection of that kind of potential crossover and how those kind of racial identities and racial definitions operate. But the high school graduation rate is only roughly 72% for black kids in Hartford. So, you know, that 30% differential and that 36% differential, those are big pathways to incarceration. Obviously, that focal population is where you would target your efforts in trying to recover them to education or to find an alternative pathway. But I assure you that that's the lion's share of your disconnected youth, I bet, in terms of where they end up down here in this population. So I wanted to give you some sense of how these pieces add up. The relationship between getting one of these outcomes and what happens later. There was a study done using what's called a quasi-experimental design, using what are called jailer judges and non-jailer judges in Cook County. And what I mean by that is that, this was a brilliant design, there are some judges who want to lock pretty much every kid up who comes before them. And they do it fairly consistent with stability. And there are some judges who want to lock up almost no children. And the docket system in the courts randomly assigns kids to these judges. And so what this study did is it looked at kids who were randomly assigned for the same crime and had similar backgrounds, and it said, what happens when they get sent to detention for the same crime versus another kid who gets sent home or some alternative to incarceration? They found out that the kid who goes to detention is 22 percentage points more likely to be convicted of a crime as an adult and end up in the prison system. So 22 percentage points, that's a huge effect size, a huge level of difference between those two populations. And let me point out again, both kids committed a crime that sent them to a juvenile court judge. But the one that went to some other alternative was 22 percentage points less likely to be incarcerated. Those who went to detention were 13 percentage points more likely to drop out of high school. And as we saw with African American males, dropping out of high school increases their probability of being incarcerated by 47 percentage points. So these outcome pathways add up. They are robustly related. These aren't just simple associational factors that have been pulled out of studies. These have been replicated across multiple longitudinal studies and have very strong effect size. And the relationship is very much causal by some study designs. So we're on the right track if this is where we're thinking about intervening to prevent this cycle. So I wanted to emphasize, I'm going to present this slide, then one more slide, and then I'll be done. I want to talk about how we think about work from a prevention standpoint and a recovery standpoint. From a prevention standpoint, we want to prevent kids who are on track or marginally on track from falling down a chute. There's this game called Chutes and Ladders that I borrowed this metaphor from. I never played it, but I heard about it and I thought it was interesting, so I'd use it. A chute, a kid falls off track at a critical moment. Some of the falling off track that happens early is a kid shows up not ready for school because of their home environment and a variety of factors associated with that. They're already off track. And so we try and do efforts like early intervention and other programs to prevent kids from falling through this chute. There's this chute towards these outcomes in adolescence, towards ending up involved in the juvenile justice system, chronic absence, the things we just saw. Here's another chute that we're trying to prevent kids from being here or marginally here and ending up down here. Same thing with dropping out of high school and being incarcerated. But what we spend a lot of time at the prevention side of taking away these chutes, but not enough prevention or not enough work on the ladders back up. How do you get back into school if you're arrested or detained? If you have been chronically absent, what is a remedy for that within schools, and how is that institutionalized versus a little compartmentalized program? It's something that is more robustly built into the system. Recovering from failing core grades. Alternatives to exclusionary discipline that allows us to deal with a kid in class through restorative practices or through PBIS or other types of interventions that try and find another way. Even if we're reducing our suspension numbers, it doesn't mean that we're doing a good job responding to the behavioral challenges of kids. We could find another exclusionary mechanism that we're hiding in plain sight in the school, but it's showing in the data we're doing a great job at reducing exclusion and so forth. Criminal offending, high school dropout. The primary thing that we propose as a remedy for dropping out of high school is the GED. Unfortunately, it's not a real remedy. The GED doesn't really add much value in terms of its long-term power for people's earnings or doing much else after they get it. In terms of the type of job you're going to get and the earnings you're going to get afterwards, a GED is essentially worthless for all intents and purposes. The data shows it doesn't benefit someone very much. But for many reasons, it's important to get. There are reasons we want to get people to get a GED, because if they get a GED, they might be, it's what we call a foot in the door idea. They might feel like, okay, hey, maybe I need to go on to college. Or maybe, hey, I need to move to the next step in my life. Maybe I need to get more. That is when you can get a positive outcome. But if they don't do that, the GED doesn't yield very much. It has limited utility. So what are the alternatives? What is the recovery pathways for the opportunity youth? Here is often what we're talking about. How do we get them back on an on-track pathway of some kind, whether that's through a post-secondary credential or some other means of vocational training that gets them there? And then the last critical ladder is re-entry for those who have been incarcerated. How do we stop the recidivism cycle? And we have ideas around that. You may be trying things in your city. You may have an example. On all of these things, we have a laundry list of interventions, types of interventions, mechanisms. We're not going to go into that today because I didn't want to take up with that time. What we wanted to do is to get your sense of what's happening on the ground or could happen on the ground in Hartford first. The landscape scan. What could we do now first? And the theory is that we can share these other resources with you about program models that we know work specifically for Black and Latino boys and girls who live in high poverty neighborhoods, because that's really ultimately what we want to know is what's going to work for that group. And then long-term unemployment, how do we get people back into the labor market who have been jobless or unemployed for several years? So these are some of the interventions that I was going to list. I'm not going to list them now, but I just want to give you the 5 principles of intervention that I want to leave you with, before we finish up the conversation we started earlier about what are some of the outcomes that we want to take on and what are some of the interventions we want to pursue with them. The first thing is that a pipeline of interventions are necessary across adolescence and emerging adulthood. There's no specific couple of years in adolescence where if we do something, we're going to get the yield that's going to deliver us outcomes in adulthood. We need to actually intervene fairly intensely in adolescence up to emerging adulthood. Both policy and program interventions are necessary. And by policy and program interventions, I mean not only stuff that we need to do, but stuff that we need to stop doing. There are a number of things that we do that are actually causing harm or making the problem worse. And so a good inventory, short of you saying we should do these new things, could be, here are all the things that we should stop doing in Hartford. Things that we know are making it hard. Like, for example, I don't know if you guys have a youth curfew here, for example. You may not. But places that do, there's a lot of punitive approaches that are the first thing that are adopted when people see a spike in youth crime, for example. Let's get them on the Scared Straight program. Makes them more likely to recidivate. Probably not a good idea. Let's do juvenile curfew. Oh, we end up just locking up kids mostly who don't commit crimes. We end up locking them up because we're ticketing them, they're still coming out, but they're actually not the core who's committing the crimes. So the stuff that we shouldn't be doing is to look at all the things that we know that either are making the problem worse or not effective is often the first landscape scan that should be conducted. Prevent off-track paths, but build recovery pathways as well. We don't do the recovery pathways. We need to invest more time into thinking about recovery pathways. And that may be taking place, and you may have ideas of what's happening here in Hartford. Target prevention to youth in single-parent families living in high-poverty neighborhoods with incarcerated fathers. Meaning if we want to interrupt this cycle, we should go right to the nexus. We should target as much as we can to kids with paternal incarceration living in high-poverty neighborhoods and single-parent families. That is going to be the population that's overwhelmingly experiencing this cycle as a majority experience phenomenon, as a majority of that population phenomenon. Other groups with less risk are not going to be experiencing it that way, but this should be the group that we target. And then rather than cognitive skills, in terms of the interventions that we focus on that are more programmatic in nature, we should be targeting mental health, socio-emotional development, identity, beliefs, and finding purpose in young people to shift their outcomes, because the evidence is growing that we get far more leverage and impact out of those types of interventions than we do with the cognitive training, meaning with the tutoring, with the other skills building associated with academic preparation, with college visits, with the college tours, with the college application assistance. We get much more impact from these socio-emotional health identity interventions than we do from some of those other things that are focused on either just dealing with administrative stuff or helping kids do their math and reading more effectively in the later grades in high school and so forth. The lion's share of the emerging research says we should be focused here. And that's it. Just a little taste, not much, not many things to say. Any questions on that? Yes, ma'am. Secure attachment? Yes.
Was tearing kids out of the families left and right. I know because I was a youth service officer who worked for DCF. Kids would come to school with mismatched socks or whatever, and they would go to the home and tear those kids right out of the family.
Yeah.
Those children are now the parents,
right,
or very young grandparents of the kids that we're seeing today. So the trauma of these parents not growing up in their home and bouncing around from foster home to foster home to foster home are now the caretakers of the kids that we're seeing today. And I think that the only thing that stopped DCF from doing that was money.
Oh, wow.
The money was cut. They didn't have as much money to put into residential homes. Residential homes began to close down because their funding was cut. And that was one of the reasons that they came up with other interventions of maybe helping the kids stay in the home. That was the only reason. It was only money. Mm-hmm. But the damage had already been done over the decades of tearing kids out of families and putting them in foster situations. So I think that needs to be measured as well, because that's trauma.
I agree, absolutely. Thank you for that.
I would like you to go back a bit, a few slides, to the slides where you were talking about ADD and ADHD.
Yeah.
And could you clarify for me, I'm trying to figure out, medically speaking, clarify for me what you meant in that particular slide.
So, the slide basically refers to the differences in learning disabilities, male son aggression, and ADHD, ADD for boys and children whose father's incarcerated compares to boys and children whose father is not incarcerated. And so if you are incarcerated, your risk of those negative outcomes goes up significantly. So it goes up 21% for the learning disability, and it goes up 41% for ADD, ADHD, because your father was incarcerated compared to a kid whose father is not incarcerated, or the population of kids.
I get that part. But what I'm asking you, what is the proof behind that? Can you tell us some about the research behind that?
Yeah, so this is a longitudinal study that looked at kids over time who were exposed to parental incarceration. And so it's not an experiment. So there could be debate about whether or not this relationship is causal. But it was a longitudinal study where they tried to establish causality. And what they did was, it's a few thousand kids that they follow over time, and they match kids, similar kids to each other, meaning that they might be from a single parent family, their parent might be poor, the kid might do poorly in school, there might be these other outcomes, but one kid has a father who goes to prison, this other kid does not. And they compare the probabilities over time of those kids developing some outcome of some kind. And it turns out, when you compare those kids in aggregate across the longitudinal studies, the kids over time whose father didn't go to prison were 41% less likely to develop ADD or ADHD than the kids whose father went to prison. Diagnosed. This was assessed. This was an assessment. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
How can we get a list of the readings that you mentioned earlier from, like adolescents, the readings that they were exposed to on oppression, and can we get a list of the books
From that program, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna have to talk to him and see if he wants to do that. I mean, he might share a list of readings.
They're just books, right? Anybody can get the books.
No, well, they're articles. So he's got like a reader that he put together for these kids to read. So they read Paulo Freire and different people.
Not entire books.
I probably can get a hold of a list of articles.
Or even the topic areas. You mentioned oppression, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of history that he covers.
Yeah.
So he does a lot of African American history, contemporary urban history, and then these other theories. But yeah, let me ask him and see if he's got something shareable, and I'll pass it along. Let me make sure I get your info, and I'll do that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I have a question.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing research into the discussion so much, because I think that's really valuable. It makes it hard to argue, in my opinion, of course.
Right on, thank you.
And I'm going to speak as myself, Sandy LaMonaco, as like a formerly incarcerated youth and formerly incarcerated adult. My question to you is, so we have a lot of different dynamic issues, as a lot of cities around the country have, and we're fighting different systems in place. So for example, we have like the chief of police, trying to lock up kids, but then try to make it look pretty with the quality of life grant. And also we have like the school, that we have great teachers and social workers in the school that want to help kids, but they're kind of hands tied to that system. So can you speak to the cross-section against systems that are put in place to kind of lock kids or young adults up, and how we work across those different systems?
Yeah, that's a huge question, and a good question. So I mean, we fundamentally know that the Cradle to Prison pipeline is an institutional handoff from one system to the next. And the disconnect across those systems is one of the biggest challenges. I don't have a simple kind of cross-system reform idea or template. I know that that's a challenge, and I don't even have a good case study, to be honest with you, that deals with this as effectively locally as it should. But, you know, the relationship of all these punitive measures and punitive systems to schools is the first place that I would start fundamentally, is pushing kids out into something that will then become a juvenile justice or criminal justice involvement, and getting the kid back into the system without the barriers that are put in place to keep kids who have entered that system and got labeled by that system from being back into the school. If I were to think about a place where this intersection matters the most, only because of how important school outcomes are to these long-term results, that's where I would focus my system efforts. And then the other players that are party to that would be kind of embedded in that, but they would be around that core. And that would be everything from, you know, mental health services to dealing with kids' homeless situation to what the police are doing. Because when I think about, I mean, policing, frontline policing is a good place for this to change. But I really think about the prosecutors and probation when I'm talking about the school and that system interface. I'm thinking about how those two things interface is probably the most important. One is because they have so much money typically allocated at some local jurisdictional level to interface. That might come down from federal dollars or state dollars. And so from a systemic standpoint, they're a good entry point for this bridging to happen. It's through them and through the resources that they can align. But police are going to have to be involved in that, especially around how they deal with diversion from a police standpoint and what needs to be done around diversion and policing from a police standpoint. If there are laws in place like curfews or other things that give rise to over-policing of young people by authorities, that needs to be confronted. But there are these other service providers that I think are around the orbit that should be tied into that core systems reform of the relationship between those two people, two agencies, two types of systems. I don't know how they are in Hartford. You probably have more expertise on that than I do, but that's my initial stab in the dark at how I would think about this. I hope that was helpful. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm wondering if in the research you've done any research around like societies, countries that actually once you've paid your debt to society, you're done? Because the felony record is an ongoing punishment to the people who get it. So there are some places in Europe, once you're done, you're done. And you actually sometimes even go back to the job that you had before.
Yes.
So what would it take to really change policies that let people be done with their incarceration and their debt to society when they're done?
Yeah, that's pretty challenging. So, I mean, the alternative has to be in an American context because, you know, we're so far from Europe and what Europe does with respect to crime because their prison systems are nothing like ours. They still embed the rehabilitative ethos. So you can get a lot of job training and education in jails and prisons in Europe. Well, you can't really get educated in prisons in America anymore, not like you used to. We used to have some real stuff inside prisons. We got rid of all that stuff years ago in upping this punitiveness of our system. So the only way I think about how we begin to approach that from an American standpoint is what I've described as coming up with some alternative we have these things called certificates of rehabilitation that we give people when they leave prison satisfactorily. We need something like that, but a 2.0 that actually has the power to rehabilitate how a person is perceived by external stakeholders, by the law enforcement system, by employers, most importantly, by housing. I mean, the array of ways you can be discriminated against because you have a felony conviction are extraordinary. I mean, there's somebody who literally cataloged their book is like 300 pages of all the ways that you will be discriminated against with a felony conviction and all the things you have to do to get out of that. And it's arcane. And so something that, you know, is like a college diploma for prison, if you will. Something that comes out and signals, because people aren't going to let us wipe away the felony conviction. We can try and do what we did in California, but it's going to only go so far because there's too many felonies that they're not going to let you wipe away. There's too many things, especially chronic felonies, they're not going to let you wipe away. So I think we need something that the certificates of rehabilitation movement started in the 1970s as an idea to provide some other signal to authorities and employers that somebody had gotten their life together. We need an updated version of that for the 21st century. And it has to be something that, that matches the right things that people need. It has to have real value. It has to be something that people can walk out and be like, they apply for housing, well, you have a felony, but I have this. Okay. So I don't know what that is, but the way America works, I feel like it's got to be something like that. We got to have some counter-credentialing to a felony conviction for the time being, because they won't let us hide the felony conviction on most felonies that matter. If we do hide it, people are going to discriminate anyway. They're going to find another way, and they usually use race as a proxy to do it. So that's kind of my thinking, but that's a tough nut to crack that I've been chewing on for a while. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Question.
So I think there are two really important implications to what you're saying about interventions and how we design interventions. First, I think assessment of those four areas is very important.
Yes.
I think we have to know where the intervention has to take place,
right,
and which is the most important. And when we develop interventions designed for those, we have to take into consideration engagement, because our kids are very hard to engage. And I love the example that you bring up of the person who's presenting philosophical essays to the kids because they're able to critically think.
Yes.
So what you're in effect saying is the way we educate this population of kids needs to change. The way we provide mental health services needs to change, because if you're going to talk about behavioral interventions as a interruption to recidivism, then you should do it in the school system as
That's
opposed.
right.
So really, you're appending the whole system.
Yes, and I think you can start. In theory, you're being disruptive potentially in a long-term sense, but there are ways to start that disruption that's not so threatening. And Becoming a Man as a program model is probably the best exemplar of this. How many people are familiar with the Becoming a Man program in Chicago? Okay, so Becoming a Man program model is genius. It's genius how they figured out how to scale their model from a few dozen kids to now thousands. But the model is based upon, one, you should administer this program model where you're going to have the captive audience that you need. That's in school. And what they do is, it's a pull-out program. So the kids miss one class a week on something that they would probably otherwise not be doing, like English or math or whatever, and they come to the BAM program for an hour. What the BAM model does, and BAM counselors interact with the kids in what they call, I'm forgetting the name, they basically run into the kids throughout the day. They run into kids in the lunchroom, they're there when the kids come to school in the morning, they're there when the kids are passing in the hallways, and they're there when the kids are after school, milling around school before they go home. These counselors are constantly interacting with the kids every day, but every week they get 1 hour pull-out of the program. And the model is built around identity tied to this rites of passage notion about what becoming a man is, what it means, and they have a Working on Womanhood program called WOW 2 that does the same thing. It's about this rites of passage idea that's been lost from our culture about how young people see themselves as moving into a person that's deserving of respect, that knows what accountability and responsibility means on their terms, but not someone saying, you know, these are the rules of accountability, but proactively responding to the kid, asking them when they do things, do you feel like you're being, you're being your accountable self when you do that? I'm not telling you, I'm asking you what you think based upon it. They engage kids in this kind of Socratic dialogue about all these things. But one of the things that they do that's very innovative is that their program activities for the hour are built around group-based cognitive behavioral therapy. It's built around understanding your thinking processes, naming them, talking about them with other kids. It's about unveiling your trauma and have kids be mutual support around trauma. And I sat in on these sessions. They're incredible. They're amazing what these kids talk about, what they reveal to each other. But one of the things that group therapy does that individual therapeutic interventions do not do, it is allows these young black boys to be helpers in very fundamental ways in somebody's life where they have almost no other opportunity to do that anywhere in their life. Where they get to come in and a peer is crying because, you know, their brother got shot and sharing that story. And they get to relate to them, they get to talk to them, they get to be their ongoing support and talk about their own experiences. And it's profound because it shapes not only the kid who's sharing that trauma, but the kid who's helping. And so it turns out all these dynamics in the group model play out and filter out into these kids' lives because they get to be helper as much as helpee, which you lose in the individual therapeutic approach. So they're able to do it in school by pulling kids out of class, so kids love to sign up for this. All the kids want to be in this thing that gets them out of all their one regular class for the week, so there's an attraction to it. But then once they're in the model, they feel like they've been inducted into this family of sorts. So there becomes this kind of broad cultural identity grouping that kids want to be affiliated with. They want to tell their friends, you know, I'm in BAM. Oh, you're in BAM? What's BAM about? And it becomes something that you want to associate with. It becomes the counter to other peer associations that they might want to claim to be involved in. We're talking about an area that's rife with gang violence and rife with those types of competitive identities for adolescents. And so I feel like they're firing on all pistons with these young black and Latino males, plus at scale, they improve high school graduation for black and Latino males by 20%, and they reduce violent crime arrests for these black males by 50%. And they're still cooking. They're now at something like 12,000 kids 4 years after they started. They only had a few dozen when they began. And so that's a model to me that I think just happens to be richly informative of all the key things that I'm talking about in terms of the principles of intervention. Where they do it, who they target, but also what they're targeting in terms of the mechanisms and the processes. Targeting the child's identity, the young male's identity. Targeting this notion of group peer support, and peer self-help that's involved in it. And also, but dealing with cognitive mental health issues, dealing with trauma, helping them work through trauma and work through trauma with their peers. So that's a model that I encourage you to look at. There are other models like that that are emerging and are being evaluated that I think are the templates for what you all should be thinking about if you're talking about adolescence. Because mostly we're talking about helping kids that are experiencing trauma, doing poorly in school, in search of peer validation and respect, and they're often finding that in places that will send them to prison. And these programs are challenging all of those things. Yes.
One more question.
Okay. Okay, bro. Where's that person at? Oh, sorry, ma'am.
Yes, you just talked about identity. Identifying one or a child's ethnic heritage.
Yes.
We have found is really important in building what you talked about as development and adding purpose to that. I saw that in one of your last slides. Would you just talk about that a bit?
The issue of identity?
Yes.
Yeah.
Identity, development, and purpose.
Yes. So, and those are all, you know, intermingled. The development of identity and purpose are closely intermingled. So, I mean, we know that identity, going to core social, psychological, and sociological identity, identity really starts to take hold in young people as soon as they hit adolescence. Because they start defining two things. They start defining themselves as separate from their family, and they also are starting to define themselves as separate from their tribe, as I call it, their racial ethnic group, etc. And they're finding often these affinity groups among peers. Boys in the neighborhood, people who do, you know, who like this type of music, who are like this thing. And so identity really starts to take hold, and in that search for identity, boys in particular, girls too, can be influenced in a lot of ways about how they think about their identity in a positive way, what's called a positive self-concept. Most of them don't think of themselves as good students in school. So that's an identity. I'm a bad student at school. Mindset interventions, for example, target that thinking to say, you're not bad in school, you just aren't, your muscle is not strong enough for what you think you want to be doing or should be doing in school. You're not inherently not smart. The muscle that you use to accomplish these academic goals are weak and they can be strengthened. If you think of yourself as a muscle that can be worked out and get stronger, you can be smarter. And it turns out when you shift kids thinking this way, their mindset, they do start to do better in school. They change what's called their academic self-concept. The Social Justice Learning Institute also does the same thing by changing kids thinking about themselves as scholars. I'm a scholar because I'm interpreting my community and how we got here, and thinking about changing that community. That's changing my identity. Purpose, the idea that you're here for more than just, getting a 9 to 5 one day, but changing the world, changing the community around you. All these things are aspects of identity-related things that we know adolescents deeply respond to when they're given opportunities to do that. And so all that's tied into, in terms of those 2 slides, many of the programs that show effectiveness in improving likelihood of high school graduation, reducing antisocial behavior like violence or delinquency or involvement in substance abuse, when they work with adolescents, they have those pieces involved. They have those things targeting their identities involved. Usually if they're kind of identity agnostic, they don't work. They work for a very short amount of times, or they have very small effect sizes. They don't really have the staying power. It's the identity shifts that alters the trajectories that we're seeing in this research with program models. And the crazy thing is that you don't really have to do a terrible amount to alter a kid's identity in terms of influencing their identity. Some of these interventions are writing exercises, like 3 15-minute writing exercises that kids are doing for the first few days of their freshman year in high school. And we're seeing it make them more likely to complete college several years later just because of this intervention alone, randomized in a large-scale trial. There are other things we're seeing that affect identity, like teachers' expectations affect the identity of children. The old Pygmalion effect studies that says if you lie to a teacher, they conducted these studies, they lied to a teacher and said that all these kids that are coming into your classroom are the smartest kids in the schools. Well, the kids were actually the lowest performing kids in the schools, but the teacher didn't know that. So they put them in the class, and within months, the kids started excelling. They started doing incredible because the expectation this teacher had for these kids was that they were all brilliant, and they started to believe that. And this is the Pygmalion effect. So there's so many things around us that are shaping self-concepts, shaping our belief in who we are, what we're capable of, and we can manipulate the environment to influence that for kids that often doesn't take, a big, huge, enormous program to achieve it, and it has sustainable results. The sad thing about the Pygmalion story is that if a teacher knows she's being lied to, or he's being lied to, if you actually tell them the truth, they can't fake it. They can't take the low-performing kids and treat them like geniuses. They just can't do it. They need to be lied to and manipulated into doing it, and it works. And so that shows the biases and other things that live around children that tell them their identity, that you're not smart, you're not capable. Counteracting those things can often be more valuable in terms of shifting their outcomes than a program that teaches them the actual skill itself, like how to read better or do the math, for example. That was a very long-winded answer to your question. I hope there was something in there useful. Yes. What are the thoughts of folks on trying to engage in mapping this right now? Because what I'm thinking is, how much do we have? How much time do we have? We have about 20 minutes. What I would like to do is to get people to finish filling out what they have over there. Because if you all, in terms of the questions that we asked, and I don't know if everybody recalls earlier, but you all broke into groups. Are you guys still in your groups, by the way? No, okay, you guys went back? What we wanted to do was figure out 3 things that were most important from this discussion. And we're going to write that up and give it back to you, and we're going to represent it on this visual canvas here, one of that slide deck, because we want to show what your thinking is on, 1, what are those pieces of the, oops, no, the other way. On the Cradle to Prison pipeline, so here, we have a bunch of links here. Links between outcomes. We wanted to know that if you guys had to start today and you wanted to take on some of these, which ones, A, have high priority? Sounds like chronic absence is a very high priority area, just based upon what those numbers suggested to me. But what area do you have, the issue is very abundantly clear, and it's connected to this pipeline, which is one of these. 1, that there is a readily identifiable constituency of support that if we wanted to gather a table and gather work around this, under the auspices of this group, this meta group here, we could do that. That we can actually find somebody to get a table around, get moving on what it means to interrupt this piece of that puzzle. And then 3, some preliminary brainstorm on efforts underway on the ground right now that need to be enhanced, things that we need to take on, things on the ground right now, things that are being done that we should stop doing, and then new things that should actually be proposed, new interventions, new policy ideas that aren't actually in play right now, but we'd like to put in play. We just wanted to figure out a minimum of maybe 5 or 6 potential of these and answers to those questions I just laid out for those things. So find a segment, tell us, you know, this is a big deal right now, based upon what we know or what the evidence says data-wise. There's people that can help us mobilize the work if we can get them together. And then there's already some stuff on the ground. Here's stuff that could be gone on the ground, and here's stuff that we should cease doing right now. That ideally would be the level of information that would get this process going about mapping kind of the field of play for what a collective action effort around interrupting this pipeline might look like going forward. That was the hope and the ambition. And does anybody want to jump in and correct me on this? But that was my theory of what we'd get out of this. And does that sound compelling? Does the idea of doing that sound interesting on a Friday at 3 o'clock after lunch and the coffee's cold? Does that sound like something you want to do? Okay, don't raise your hand if that's what you want to do. Okay, it's unanimous. We can also, because you know, I don't want to switch to an exercise that won't yield much, but I do want to see if maybe we can start talking about it in the room, and maybe if you could start grabbing things for me. Maybe you guys can stand up and start riffing about those right now. 20-minute group conversation doesn't have to be as structured as we might have proposed, but where do you think the action should be as priorities right now on some of these? If we had to pick one, so I worked with the Juvenile Justice Coalition that had 100 different organizations in it, and we did a dot voting thing, and we had a whole list of agenda, and everybody went around, and we picked 15 things we were going to focus on over the next year. And I said, let's just see if we can get that to one thing. And we got it to one thing, and they ended up winning that one thing over the next year. They got state policy. So how about, can we figure out what one thing might be? Yes, sir. Yeah, so my question is, you tell me, chronic absence and its relationship to high school dropout, you know, both thinking about prevention and recovery there. Is it school discipline? That's the priority? No, I'm talking about the work in Hartford. Like, if there are a collective effort behind it, what do you think could galvanize the group? I'm sorry, it's hard to hear you.
You'd need to assess the issue with a tool. You would need some kind of survey or measure that could determine where the weaknesses are and why. Which ones do we do a decent job with, and which ones don't we do a decent job with?
Okay, okay. So
there are 4 areas that you could study those in different ways and different means, but which are the most important ones? What, is Hartford the same way as New Haven? I just heard today that New Haven has 20 truancy outreach workers. We don't have any. So that's a different problem that Hartford has that New Haven doesn't. And they're only 30 miles apart.
Okay. So is dropout prevention connected to chronic absence a big priority area here, or no? How about anything that you all know has traction right now?
Can I suggest something?
Yes, please.
So it is Friday, and it is after lunch, and it is before a holiday weekend. What I'm proposing is, and what I've learned, sometimes the hard way, is we have to actually work on where people are actually excited about and passionate about, so we can get the work done. So as much as I greatly appreciate that we could study some more, the good news is we've studied this a bit already, but I need to know what do you guys want to work on? Because you got to have your hair on fire. If your hair is not on fire about this stuff, we're not going to get it done. That's just being honest. So if you guys can commit today to help us like collectively, right? So it could be a we, collectively work on this, then we at the city could continue to provide support moving forward and, in different forms and formats, right? But we need to get some sense of input today from the group. What do you want to start on first? Pass my mic, I guess.
So,
thank you.
My opinion, and it's just an opinion, but it's also based on interesting series of convenings that I've been a party to in the past even just couple of weeks. I think chronic absences have been identified as a serious issue in Hartford. And if we're going to address a systemic issue or series of issues, my feeling is we need to start at the beginning, as close to the beginning as we can. I mean, we're talking about youth age, 13 and 14 and up. We're not talking about preschoolers, which that is another issue. But in this age group, my opinion is that if we identify that we have this chronic absence issue, that would be a great place to start.
At the notes that people took in their small groups, just a quick glance, probably at least a third of them list chronic absence.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so that sounds like a high priority that we should be thinking about.
Hartford has begun to do trainings with principals and certain school leaders in restorative justice and restorative practices. So I think the question could be, in what ways can we augment this and further empower this to spread to all the schools in Hartford so that, they've begun, some people have bought in, and some people haven't been trained yet. What else can we do in the face of all these budget cuts? Is there a way that we can spread the virus?
Yeah. So, and that's around school discipline, right? School discipline reform?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that if you look at these issues, which are really paramount in our school district right now, they really are intermingled and intermeshed, because when you look at chronic absence, which we know we have a high rate in the district, it really speaks to then the behavior issues in discipline and children not succeeding in class and seeing themselves as an academic success. So they are all very interrelated, but I also think there needs to be a mindset shift and a bias shift, because although we do have restorative practices, we do have PBIS, we do have a bunch of different things to address these issues, I think we really need to focus on quality, quality staff, and quality programming to get these off the ground. So that's one thing. The other thing that I was thinking is that engagement came through in a lot of the things we were talking about. Not only parent engagement, community engagement, and engaging our kids so they want to stay in school so they don't act out in school. So once the kids are engaged, then they could succeed in math and reading. We also have to look at, when we're talking to, Cradle to Prison Pipeline, reading scores. Okay, reading scores in 3rd grade indicate sometimes how many cells to build. So we have to look at the quality teaching and learning in those classes, pre-K through 6, so that we can get those kids off to high school and succeed. So it's hard to pinpoint one thing because it mushrooms into a bunch of things that have to be addressed systematically. And we also don't want to systematically push kids out, but we have to have a real mindset shift, especially in some of our more challenging schools in the district, which tend to lose resources and don't attract the most qualified staff. So we really have to look at it globally, but I think engagement of student, community, and parent is a big ticket item to address all those things.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, I see a lot of hands. The other thing as I'm walking over here is, again, our department goes prenatal to 24, and there's actually work that's being done on the early piece, so I don't want people to think we have decided just one slice. It's actually multiple slices, and we found that there was so much content that we had to break up the days. So what we will do is make sure that our distribution list is a combined list of folks. So then, to your point about the reading, that happens, for third grade, and where we are in Hartford is not a great number. Then if you want to be involved in that side of the work, that all of you could also be involved in that side of the work as well and have voice.
Hello, my name is Chanel Morris. I'm 24 years old. The miss here said, what makes you passionate? What is going to make you really involved with this? And while I do love this conversation, it's exactly what I work on and think about. What makes me passionate is working towards prison abolition and replacing the prison with humane institutions that address mental health, that address affordable education and job training that individuals need. And so, we can try to target things like chronic absenteeism, and we might try to investigate it. But what if we investigate it and we find out there's very little we can do about the chronic absenteeism? Maybe it's the fact that certain days a week, the mom needs a babysitter for the younger sibling. What do we do? How do we step in? A lot of these issues are poverty related. And so what are we doing to target the root issue of poverty? So I think that there's limitations in looking at certain things like chronic absenteeism. It needs to be eradicated, but then there's those underlying root issues that we're trying to overlook in certain instances and try to get a different outcome. So I see both in targeting poverty as the root issue, and then also thinking beyond, even prison reform, because prisons are not humane spaces. Prisons are cages. They have replaced the plantation from the slavery system. So, how do we think about spaces for Black and brown bodies that is restorative, that is humane, that is helpful for physical and mental health? So I would like to challenge all of us to think about prison abolition, think about the redistribution of wealth, and the fact that it is a priority of our mayor, it's a priority of our legislators to warehouse and cage Black and brown bodies and Black and brown babies who end up in the juvenile justice system. Thank you.
All right.
Anybody else?
Hi, so most of the members of my group are gone, but I do want to pinpoint a couple of things. One thing that we discussed was the community schools. And I'm not sure if they talked about it earlier, but the community schools involves other CBOs and nonprofits who have services that the school can't provide. Teachers teach. When you're talking about dealing with cognitive behaviors, you're talking about soft skills training, that's not really at the capacity at a lot of these schools. So partnering with community-based organizations that can come in and apply some of these cognitive development things, soft skills, all that good stuff. But there was one situation I thought was quite unique, and it may not be as unique, actually. They were talking about a participant or a student's mother had asked their child, the student, to leave school to come home and help her out because either she had to work or to watch the baby. So when you look at that, it may not be all the child, it may be the parent. So we need to have a holistic conversation. It needs to be individually based as well, so that way we can get to some of the root problems. If we do it as a cookie cutter, it's not really all that successful if you're not getting to those specific needs. So Anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Got it. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, so we are coming to the close of our day. First of all, thank you, Arnold Chandler and his team for coming. I appreciate
Pleasure.
it.
Thank you.
So as he said, we have some work to do behind the scenes. He provided his email address. You should have some contact information for us at the city if you have thoughts when you walk out of here. Is it in the parking lot? If it's next week or the week after, know that this does not stop today. One of the things that we are going to do is reflect. We did videotape today's event, so that's going to be available to you, also to your peers. Please share it. Again, if you have some additional thoughts, we'll appreciate that. Our plan is that we want to mobilize. We realize this is not easy. This is beyond a heavy lift. We're talking about significant structural and systemic issues that most of us have lived with most of our lives. And we are trying to make change happen now. And I just want to really thank all of you for your willingness to be part of that. As we close today, I believe there's an evaluation form inside of your packet that I am going to ask that you do take some time to fill out. The way that we can continuously improve is to really listen to you and your voice and your feedback. So please take the time, if you will, to complete that before you leave. Fill in the bubbles. So she's asking to make sure you fill in the bubbles, okay? The other thing is we are here at the City of Hartford trying to save money, so you have a badge. We're gonna ask you to return that badge so we can reuse it so that when we are able to have another event like today, we won't have that additional cost. We're trying to be as cost effective as we can. And in that vein, I do want to also acknowledge that today's event was us putting several dollars together to make this happen, including the fact that we are the Youth Service Bureau for the City of Hartford. I heard some conversation about what happens in New Haven versus Waterbury. We're all different youth service bureaus and we do have different models, but if you guys want to have that conversation, we can have that conversation too, especially around truancy. There's a huge issue around truancy that's very much connected to this conversation about chronic absenteeism. And so with that, I want to also just acknowledge my team that made this happen today with the help of some of our key partners. Please join me in thanking everyone who were speakers today, who spoke up. Really, I greatly appreciate it. A special shout out to my youth services team being head by Nancy Boone over there for their hard work in making today happen. And, Arnold, I'm going to thank Delta Airlines, too, so that you got here okay. So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And we're going to send out those slides and other materials, so don't worry about that. But again, in all seriousness, do feel free to outreach to us. Have a wonderful holiday weekend, everyone, and take care, and happy Memorial Day. Thank you.